thank you for joining us for this. It's the second of our virtual roadshows for the Agroecology-TRANSECT project. And the aim of these events, they're slightly longer webinars, which we try and pack in lots of speakers. And the aim is to try and showcase or spotlight some of the, I'm biased, but some of the really cool work we're doing around agroecology in our innovation hubs across Europe and all over the place. So we're really glad you can join us. The aim is this is accessible to all, whether you're a researcher or a farmer or just an interested person at home or a gardener. I can see we've got all of those kind of people on the chat today. So if you're itching to find out more about anything you hear today, I'd encourage you, we'll always share links to more information. Some of the researchers have already given more detailed webinars on what they'll talk about today, so we'll link to that. You can contact us for more information or read their papers and all sorts. So hopefully that explains a bit more what we're going to do today. And I'm going to introduce TRANSECT project in a second, but first of all, Anna was going to give us a bit of a state of play of biodiversity and some stats on biodiversity as it is now. We've got a couple of slides on that. I'll explain a bit more about how Agroecology-TRANSECT works, and then we'll crack on with our first speaker today. Anna, did you want to talk us through, just set the scene of biodiversity?
Absolutely. I think that we were thinking about the best way to introduce the importance of the topic that we're talking about. And I think that we all have in the back of our heads the importance of biodiversity as a general thing. But we wanted to show you some of these numbers because it kind of brings to reality the challenges that we're facing. So as we mentioned, Agroecology-TRANSECT is a project that is in Europe. So we're going to be talking about European data, but you can sort of like explore a little bit more for the different continents. I see that people from Taiwan and Latin America are here as well. Just as a point of reference, you can see here that there's studies that have highlighted that around 81% of the habitats in Europe are actually in poor status, and that has a really huge effect on biodiversity. About €1 invested in nature restoration, it adds €4 to €38 in benefits. So you can see that this is not only about the importance of our habitats, it does have an economic effect, but really importantly, on a habitat basis, if you think about how important it is for us to live in this world, biodiversity is absolutely crucial for that to happen. Some sobering facts: 1 in 3 butterfly and bee species are in decline here in Europe. Another number that really talked to me was that since 1990, more than half of all the farmland bird populations in Europe have disappeared, just reduced numbers. It's farmland birds, okay, but it's a huge amount. And you can see the impact that farming actually has. When you consider that about 40% of the EU lands area is farmland, you can start to put all these numbers together and see the impact that it has. So you can see as well that 1 in 3 pollinator species are also in sharp decline, and we depend on biodiversity to actually live our lives, farm, have food, have clean water, have clean environments. So when you think about the impact that these declining numbers have in terms of biodiversity, you can start adding up and realizing why it's important to address it as a particular topic like we're doing it today. So as we mentioned, biodiversity is actually the foundation of healthy, resilient ecosystems. It supports pollination, it supports pest control, it supports nutrient cycling, water retention, climate regulation. And so the more vulnerable we make them through our actions, the more vulnerable we actually are. So that's why the EU's new nature restoration law is really, really important. It has been recently passed. If anybody wants to look for it, it's actually quite comprehensive. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about policy as well. So that's why it's relevant. But it's for the first time that it's actually legally binding, that we have legally binding targets to restore degraded ecosystems across the EU. So that's really, really crucial. And that's where sort of like we connect with the importance of agroecology. I'm assuming that people coming here are attracted by the idea of agroecology, but it's sort of like such a compelling alternative to the way that we're doing things at scale at the moment. It's a way of farming that enhances biodiversity. It actually works with it rather than deplete it. And it's just about working with the natural processes. So you're going to be seeing today as well when we talk, it's about bringing crop diversity, it's about agroforestry, it's about mixed systems, hedgerows, flower strips, cover crops, healthy soils. It's sort of like a fantastic way of actually farming that helps regenerate the landscapes. So in doing so, of course, it restores biodiversity while also creating food. So it's kind of a win-win that we should all be backing. So many farmers are already leading the shift, and today we're going to be talking to a few experts that are on the front lines of this change. And so we just wanted to bring this information to you, but also just bring you the passion of all the people that are speaking today. I really encourage you to ask them questions. You're going to hardly find a better team than what we have here, if I say so myself. So it's just, again, today you're going to be hearing about practice, you're going to be hearing about policy, you're going to be hearing about academia. It's a golden team that has come together to talk about biodiversity, explore how to bring it back to the fore when we're talking about farming. And so with that, I just invite you to stay tuned and learn a little bit more about our project, which is Agroecology-TRANSECT. Hopefully, you're going to be quite passionate now, as we can clearly see we all are here. Tim.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for bringing the passion on a Wednesday morning. So I'll take a couple of minutes just to explain a bit more about TRANSECT. If we've set the scene on biodiversity, we'll set the scene on the Agroecology-TRANSECT. Our overriding aim is to lay the groundwork for agroecology as the future of farming by learning, engaging, and inspiring action. Well, what does that mean? So Agroecology-TRANSECT is a European Horizon Europe funded project. It's a 4-year project. We're about to go into our 4th year, which means it's a really exciting time. We've got a lot of our results are starting to come through, and we've done our forming and our storming, and now we're, as a project, we're performing, I like to think. And we know that farming can work in a way that benefits everyone. It can be regenerative, mitigate climate change, and improve biodiversity, which we're talking about today. And we say this type of farming is called agroecology. One of the things we're doing as a project is having a dialogue around agroecology and what that means to people. And we will be looking forward to sharing some of that later on. We're not there yet. As you can imagine, it's been a very lively discussion within our consortium, within our group. I think we believe that an important solution lies in systems, agricultural systems that embrace agroecological principles, that build on natural processes, ecological principles, and socio-ecological feedbacks that foster these. And I've just said our goal is to lay the groundwork for agroecology. As a partnership, we are 11 innovation hubs, more of that later, and we work with 19 partners across 12 different European countries. I say European because Switzerland and the UK are also involved as part of the Horizon project. And it's a very broad project. So we look at involving farmers, advisors, policymakers, as well as the kind of agri-food industry to bring change in policy, practice and production, which sounds good. In reality, it's quite tricky having such a broad remit and meeting all of those stakeholders. But it also means it's super rich and we look at lots of different elements. And as we said, over 4 years, we're working with our innovation hubs, united in an ambition to learn with people and engage and inspire them with the dramatic and positive impact nature-based farming has on ecosystems, industries and communities, hopefully opening everyone's eyes to its possibilities and potential. A little bit more about our innovation hubs. We're going to hear in a second in our video our pre-prepared VT from some of our innovation hubs, and then we're lucky to have live here representatives from our hubs in Bulgaria, Hungary and Switzerland, one of whom is in the field collecting data as we speak and will hopefully join us before she's due to talk, from Switzerland. But they cover a really broad range of farming practices and types, from kind of large scale arable to sort of really small scale, almost subsistence farming systems in Spain. And these kind of innovation hubs with their multi-actors are kind of key to the project. They're key to grounding the research that we do in the land, on farm, at a field scale. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about our projects, that it kind of has that broad overview on a European level, but then focuses right in to kind of member states and to regional and local farming and food systems. Last slide on Transect, but what are we aiming to do? We hope to unfold the full potential of agroecology for European agriculture. We do this by quantifying the potential of agroecology on 3 pillars. They're climate change adaptation and mitigation, biodiversity conservation, we'll talk about that today, in agroecosystems, and farm socio-economic resilience. So everything we look at, we look in those prisms. We mobilise knowledge in 11 innovation hubs, as we've said, and we aim to engage with farmers and other local stakeholders to generate actionable knowledge. So that's a term we use a lot in our project, and it's knowledge that can support stakeholder decision making, whether that's farmers, whether that's farm advisors, agronomists, or whether that's policy makers. But we want to link that back to action, and hopefully we do that. So that's enough from me. Hopefully that sets the scene. There's a lot more to our project. You can go on the website and find out more. There's loads of other older webinars of our work so far and talking about innovation hubs and other things. But we're here to talk about biodiversity. And before I do, hand over to Cian Blaix to talk about his studies into the effects of agroecology on biodiversity. Anna wanted to show a short film that we've just made. It was finished yesterday, and we've kind of been all over our innovation hubs all over Europe in the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks, telling some of the stories of our hubs and hopefully showing some of the stories of biodiversity that we are kind of uncovering as Agroecology-TRANSECT.
The current agri-food system is actually not working from an environmental perspective. It's completely unsustainable. Conventional farming destroys the soils on which all life depends.
With 25% of the world's soils being degraded, the major decline in biodiversity is largely attributable to agriculture.
Biodiversity matters because it's the network that supports life.
We depend on biodiversity.
Agroecology tries to reduce inputs needed for production and therefore to use biodiversity and the supporting services, the regulating services to enhance production in a more natural way. That's why agroecology and biodiversity go hand in hand.
So Agroecology-TRANSECT is already having positive impacts in Inspira Territorio by inspiring us. This work we have been doing on the chestnuts with the experiment on the soils, it stemmed as an idea within Agroecology-TRANSECT.
Y he observado que la finca llevaba en unos principios poca productividad y ha ido subiendo esa productividad a pesar de que son castaños centenarios. Es decir, la biodiversidad que hay de plantas y el no laboreo de alguna forma ha beneficiado a la rentabilidad del cultivo. No creo que sea una competencia, sino que es un plus que ayuda a que el árbol genere más y tenga también más defensas ante cualquier enfermedad que pueda afectar.
When we talk about the cultural value of biodiversity, a good example is the flowering meadow you see behind me, because these flowering meadows are part of a landscape. And to have these meadows and this grassland, we need to have cows that graze them. And the grassland you can find here influence cheese nutritional and sensory quality. And that's also what makes the cheese being so unique.
Alors on essaye de lier les pratiques par rapport à la diversité de nos prairies afin d'aller au but recherché. On essaye d'adapter les fauches, par exemple, par rapport à la date de pousse de la prairie et des espèces présentes sur les prairies. Et l'idée, c'est de continuer à préserver cette diversité et de ne pas forcément augmenter la taille de l'exploitation, car aujourd'hui, on a quand même un produit de qualité qui valorise et qui permet de dégager un revenu.
I think strip cropping could be a real solution for farming, because the thing is, you can keep sort of your standard practices. You can keep your crop management the same, but you just do it in a strip. And at the same time, you have all the benefits of biodiversity, because your system as a whole gets a lot more biodiverse.
Since we have switched from a monoculture system to a strip cropping system, we can see throughout the farm that the different kinds of insects and different kinds of birds can now find a habitat everywhere. So if there is a pest in the arable crop, the natural enemies can quickly find the pest. And also, we think it's really pretty in the landscape, so that also gives us a lot of pleasure, of course.
Functional biodiversity acts like an orchestra. The plants are the musician, and it's not about how many musicians you have to combine the right instrument. The aim of functional biodiversity is that they play together in a harmonical way. This should sound great.
At this stage of the project, we already have some clear results that agroecology benefit biodiversity. And that's important to consider that the benefits of agroecology are not a notion, but a fact.
Without grazing, without people, this wouldn't exist. It would just be this almost lifeless forest. There wouldn't be butterflies, there wouldn't be pollinators. The general diversity would be much lower. We people are a force for good. We can be that.
Can start with Janka, who's actually a lovely area we visited and where most of the film was recorded. So Janka, do you want to take over and showcase first the Innovation Hub, what you're doing there, and then we'll have a short conversation about it?
Yes, actually, since I was having the problems yesterday when we were doing the testing, I'm so happy to be here and to be able to share our experience in Western Stara Planina, where our innovation hub is situated. And Western Stara Planina is actually the most western section of the Balkan Mountains range that lays at the border with Serbia. Our innovation hub aims to maintain this rich biodiversity that we have in the region, comprised of the high nature grasslands and the forests there, which are split 50-50 or half and half from the land outside settlements, while improving the socioeconomic resilience of these areas. A very important aspect of our work in the Innovation Hub is the link that we make between the national and European policy level and the local realities and local needs of farmers. Okay, so a short presentation of the Innovation Hub. And I've selected this picture to illustrate the Innovation Hub because the 50-50 share of grasslands and forest is actually dependent on having people in the region, because if we don't have people, we don't have the animals. And if we don't have the animals, we are going to have a very different type of biodiversity. So not that it will be less biodiversity, but it will be very different. And from this perspective, it is important to keep the people in the region, to have the animals, to have this diversity of biodiversity, if I may say. Okay. And why we started working in this region? First, because it's very beautiful. I mean, everybody wants to work in a beautiful region, but a very important aspect is that this region is very close to Sofia, but for many decades it suffered from depopulation and low economic development. So the land abandonment threat was very significant in the region. And an additional aspect is that when the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union was introduced in Bulgaria, what we observed is that the measures that were targeting exactly these high nature value grasslands could not reach farmers. So for us in STEP, it was very important to understand why policy cannot reach farmers, and then it cannot achieve its objectives that are there. And we'll be hearing more on policy later on, I think, in the original structure of the event from Lizzie. But this is one region where we were facing many of the barriers of policy in Bulgaria. So we were thinking that if we can make it right in this region, we can make it right elsewhere in Bulgaria. So that's why we chose it to be there. And to be able to achieve the objective of making the policy working well, we have set up a partnership group. So if you go to the next photo for our region, which is like more than 10 years old, like we were young and beautiful back then, but this group here represents quite a good mixture of people, experts. So we have farmers, livestock farmers, we have people from the national administration, from the Ministry of Agriculture, we have advisors, we have also researchers, both botanic researchers, but also agronomists that can help us ensure that we keep a balance between the biodiversity, pure biodiversity, and the functional biodiversity, and the grazing value of the grasslands, because for farmers this is very important. And this group that you see here is still operational, and their contribution is critically important for us to make sure that whatever we develop and propose is based on realities.
Great.
So,
thanks, Janke.
yeah.
And we, as a group, we had the pleasure of visiting you all in Sofia. Well, actually on the High Plains a month or so ago, and I can't say how beautiful it is. Hopefully, you get a feel for it a bit in the film. But it was just, we walked where the next picture is taken, I think, at the same site through, and it was thick with butterflies and invertebrates and so many different species. It was wonderful. Now, I know that you're testing a kind of results-based agro-environment scheme there on the Western Stara Planina. I kind of wondered what kind of motivated you to sort of go down that route of looking at results-based payments, yeah, if you tell us a bit more about what you do and what are the challenges to that?
Well, what motivated us to start working on result-based payments? Two things. Well, initially two things. One thing is that when we were doing like a longer-term monitoring of the effects of high nature value farming support in Bulgaria and in the region, we found out that in fact there was no biodiversity monitoring on the effects of these schemes and the supports that is being implemented. So for us it was like, okay, 10 years of support, 14 years of support, and then what are really the effects on biodiversity? And meanwhile, we were also involved in the European network of result-based schemes, and we were really motivated by the fact that they are based on results achieved for biodiversity. So all agri-environmental payments are based on the results for biodiversity. But then looking at how the schemes are implemented, we were really, well, there is no such official schemes in Bulgaria to start with. And we were quite concerned that the level of information, biodiversity information that is required to be able to run such scheme could be quite a big barrier for us. So in the discussion of the, I mean, like 5 years or more back in the history of our innovation hub, we were thinking, okay, so where next in our activities there? So we decided to test how would the result-based scheme would look like in Bulgaria and in the region. So what type of biodiversity data is there? How it can be linked to individual farm parcels? Can we get farmers involved in the monitoring of the biodiversity? Because in many of the schemes, farmers are actively involved. So to what extent can we involve farmers? How are we going to train farmers? What type of information we should provide to them so that they can become involved? So these are the motivations, and we were very, very, very optimistic. And in the implementation of the activities, we were like a bit, okay, more barriers are coming up and more barriers are coming up. And the first biggest challenge probably was to come to a list of representative species for the grasslands in Bulgaria, because like there are different type of grassland habitats, and each of them has different biodiversity values and species that are very important. So narrowing it down so that farmers can work with it still is quite a challenge, but we are testing it with farmers, so hopefully we will come to it at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I imagine that the challenge, kind of even just coordinating with busy farmers to get that data, and then sometimes getting data on top of everything that they have to do anyway. You know, we all know how trying to run a farm or a small farm can take all of your time and energy already. To then look at the bureaucracy on top of that is an interesting challenge. I'm hoping we'll come back to this as well. There's a couple of questions, and we'll take questions from the floor to all the speakers probably at the end of the session. But I'd quite like to link it into the wider European picture perhaps, and the policy picture, but it would be good to do that after we've heard a bit from Lizzie, who will talk about CAP, and also from Adrien, who's going to talk about some looking at how we analyse different criteria and different indicators of biodiversity, which is kind of relevant to what you were just saying about just trying to get a good list of species in that very specific landscape and environment. So thank you, Janke. I think we'll stop there. If there's not anything else you don't want to add for now, but it would be great to come back to you. There's already some questions in the chat, so hopefully we'll come back and put those to you if you're still with us in a little while. Also, I think someone said in the chat, but Janke also is on a webinar about engaging with policymakers about agroecology that's on our website, and there's a link in the chat. So if you want to find out, not now, stay with us for the next hour and a bit, but when we've finished, you can click on the link and watch that webinar. So thank you very much, Janke, and for sharing your beautiful part of Bulgaria with us. I think that Cian is back and he's connected with his phone, and I think we can go back and we might try and hear from him about his meta-analysis. He's in the sunshine.
Not only that, he went outdoors.
I think Cian was just out sunbathing, surely, in Italy. Cian has recently moved to Italy, I hope you don't mind me saying. And so it looks like he's enjoying some Italian sun. So I will bring up your slides, Cian, and we'll come to you if that's okay, if you're happy. And then we'll be back on the normal order of things. Okay. Brilliant. Cian Blaix, who will introduce himself, because until recently was with INRAE and Agroscope, I think. But I'll let you introduce yourself, Cian, and then go through your slides. Over to you.
Great. Thank you. I'll switch off the video though, just not to, so that I don't, so I keep the good connection. To introduce myself, yes, I was a researcher at Agroscope and INRAE until recently, and I've now started to work on a farm in Italy. And it's my great pleasure to get this opportunity today to talk to you about the work I carried out during the project. And so, yes, agriculture and biodiversity. I mean, Anna already talked about this, but she gave a nice overview of the situation. So what I would like to highlight here as an introduction is the role that agroecology can have in mitigating this the contribution of the current agricultural system to biodiversity loss. And agroecological systems, so they're designed with the aim of optimizing ecological processes. So, for example, the nutrient cycles and so on, and promoting multiple ecosystem services. So soil fertility, pollination, and pest regulation, for example. And if we look at the pictures on the slide, you see two examples. The one above is a lettuce monoculture, probably a conventional system. And the one below is one of our innovation hubs that has an inter-row system. And the contrast between the two photos is quite stark. They both grow lettuce, but one is much more diverse than the other. And the idea behind looking at agroecology and the positive effects that it may have on biodiversity can be seen in this picture where we have a lot of diversity in crops, which we could assume leads to diversity in resource types that could attract more different types of arthropods or soil biota than a simple monoculture of lettuce. Next slide, please. So sorry, it's taking a bit of time to load, for me anyway. So the idea was to look at the evidence that's out there in the scientific literature regarding how agroecology affects biodiversity. So to do this, we gathered data from the scientific literature, and we analyzed this data to see the effects on biodiversity. Next, please. And we faced our first major challenge, and that was to select agroecological interventions. So how do we select agroecological interventions? Next slide, please. So because it's not like agroecology is not like organic farming. You can't just tick boxes, follow rules, and then you get a certification for being agroecological. Agroecology is a paradigm which is based on multiple principles. So instead of looking at from a point of view of ticking boxes, we need to adapt a view of an agroecological gradient. So the idea is to adhere as most as possible to these principles in order to be as much as possible agroecological, let's say. And so this poses a problem for selecting determining what's an intervention, how agroecological is an intervention. But we can we base our work on previous work, and we use frameworks that were established to give us an idea of how we can classify practices in terms of different levels. So we identified 4 different levels for our study of agroecology from 0 to 3, 0 being conventional and 3 being the most agroecological. And we decided to select the 2 most agroecological levels. So input substitution, so level 2, and redesign level 3, which is on your right. And these practices and systems must adhere to at least one of the principles of agroecology. And at level 2, you have an input substitution level. It's more related to what the basic interventions are needed to obtain an organic farming certificate. So input substitution refers to substituting, for example, chemical or synthetic inputs with organic or biodiversity, let's say, alternatives. While the redesign level 3, you're actually increasing the diversity in your system by redesigning the whole system, whether that is by increasing the diversity of practices, by including livestock management, for example, along with cropping system, or whether you're adding semi-natural habitats, these are hedgerows, trees, and so on, in your agroecosystem, or flower strips, for example. Next slide, please. So we have our data, we have our studies. We've determined more or less what are our agroecological interventions, and we have classified them at different levels. And now this allows us to compare for each study the agroecological intervention with a more conventional one. And what we found was the effect was positive for biodiversity in general. For all functional groups that we identified, so that's on the left, you see these are represented by the different icons. So we have the primary producers, macro decomposers, so your earthworms and so on, micro decomposers, so bacteria and fungi. You have your predators and your pollinators. And the effect of agroecology was positive for all these groups. And then it was also positive for 3 of the 4 out of the 4 systems that we identified. So you have your arable cropping systems, you have your perennial systems, which are orchards and vineyards, and also you have your grasslands, for which the effect was positive. For the last type, the horticultural system, we found a positive trend, but it was not statistically significant. Next slide, please. So finally, we can also, since we have our different levels, we can also look at how going up the agroecological transition gradient, how does that affect biodiversity? So here, I won't go into too much detail, but level 0 and level 1, we amalgamated because it was not always easy to distinguish between both levels in the studies. And we compared these 2 levels with level 2, so our input substitution level, and level 3, which is the most agroecological level, and it's the redesign level. And we found that if you compare so the conventional with input substitution, well, we have a greater effect on biodiversity in the input substitution level. And the same if you, as long as you go up the transition level, you increase biodiversity, basically. So comparing level 2 and level 3, again, level 3 has greater biodiversity than level 2. Next slide, please. So to conclude, studies conducted in Europe show a general positive effect of agroecological interventions on biodiversity. Biodiversity of all the study groups benefited from agroecology, and effects tend to be more positive for interventions which are more agroecological. Next, please. And so the general message, take-home message, is to support your local agroecological farm or network to contribute to nature conservation. And that should be the last slide, I think.
Thank you, Cian, for giving a very brief overview to what is actually a very detailed academic study and meta-analysis that you have done. And as we've said before, if you're interested in more of this, more kind of perhaps as a researcher or a scientist yourself, there is a webinar which goes into more detail, and we'll be publishing more on this, I imagine, before the end of the project. And again, questions, please put your questions in. We'll answer some in the chat, but we'll come back with all the questions when we've heard from everyone and try and link them together, but do chuck them in the chat. Cian, I've got a couple of questions for you, if that's okay, before we move on. Really positive that it sounds like you've said there, all studied groups benefited, biodiversity benefited from agroecology. So it's really positive news coming out of your research. I wonder if there's any practices or interventions which particularly stood out as kind of not quick wins, but an easy way to boost biodiversity. If you're able to kind of give any sort of general examples of that, any kind of obvious practices.
Yes, unfortunately, our analysis didn't allow us to go into that much detail at looking at individual interventions. And what I suspect that even if it did, it's the answer that nobody likes, and that would be it depends. Because I think it's very context dependent. If we take, for example, flower strips planted in a landscape that already has a lot of diversity are not going to have the same effect as flower strips planted in a landscape with little in terms of what we call ecological infrastructure. So your semi-natural habitats, your hedgerows, and wild vegetation. And also that flower strip is going to affect insects that feed on the nectar and pollen. It's probably not going to have much of an effect on the soil biota, for example.
Okay.
So but what I can say though is that what we find, I think that's a take-home message, is that every little helps. So whether you're in a very conventional system and you decide to substitute your inputs with non-organic alternatives. This is going to help in terms of increasing biodiversity. And on the other hand, if you're in an organic system that already has a lot of positive management practices, but you want to go even more further towards an agroecological system, then this is also going to increase biodiversity.
Okay, great, thank you. And just finally, and briefly, because we've lots to get through, are there any risks involved in implementing some of these practices? So are there kind of almost unexpected consequences of kind of making these changes that on the face of it will boost biodiversity?
Yes, well, we didn't look at this in terms of production, but that would be the classical risk that's found in literature, that you might have a trade-off between production and increasing biodiversity using agroecological interventions. But what I can say about this is, well, for example, if you take flower strips, you're taking away a part of the land that will be devoted to a crop. So this is a part of land that's not going to be productive. However, the flower strip might increase the productivity of the other crops around it if they're dependent on, for example, pollinators, or if they have pest problems that flower strips can maybe attract predators of those pests. So it's not that straightforward. And with agroecology, it's a very much a holistic system. So even though we talk about individual interventions, you have to look at the bigger picture, and agroecological systems tend to be more resilient, so to pest problems or climate problems, meteorological problems. And also you won't sell, they also work in terms of you can't just be focused on production, but you have to think about also revenue. So what you produce, you might not sell at the same price for when you're in an agroecological system.
So there's a trade-off perhaps between yield and in some cases biodiversity, which does make me mindful of, we saw it briefly in the film earlier, but the strip cropping network in the Netherlands, that's one of our innovation hubs in the project, and how they're sort of the bonus of that way of doing things is actually you could be growing 2, 3, 4 different crops next to each other, and also bringing in the biodiversity in your crop, right?
Yes.
So there's
in that case, you can also have an over-yielding effect. So you might actually have increased production compared to growing a crop alone, due to complementarity between the species. So it's not definite.
It's a complex picture. Well, we appreciate you simplifying what is a very complex kind of thing, Cian, and bringing your meta-analysis of, I think, 270 odd other academic studies, right, that you looked at?
Yes, yeah,
a lot,
something like that.
So thank you, and hopefully you stay around with your connection, and we have got questions coming in, and I think for our speakers might be able to answer some of the questions in the chat, because we won't have loads of time, so feel free to jump on if you're one of the presenters today to answer those questions, and we will come to some at the end. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Anna to introduce Tamás, who I think is back with us despite more technical challenges in Hungary. But thank you, Cian, and over to Anna.
Sorry, I was not being able to turn on my audio again. Hi, Tamás again. So
Hello.
everybody, just introducing Tamás Miglix, who is actually one of our experts in the Living Interro Innovation Hub in Hungary. So before I even try to ask any questions or say something, as usual, the best person to introduce themselves is Tamás. So I will give you the floor for a wee second, and then we can have a short conversation about what you're doing there and what the results that you're seeing are. So Tamás, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Fine. So sorry for the inconvenience. I'm Tamás Miglix. I'm a researcher of the Hungarian Research Institute for Organic Agriculture, and I work in vineyards and orchards. Since there is a global biodiversity decline, which is severely affected by agriculture, since agricultural land takes a great portion of our lands. We try to mitigate this loss in perennial cultures, since they are relatively stable and they are there for several decades. and they can act as stepping stones or green corridors for biodiversity. And we try to achieve these goals by sowing mixtures. And I will talk about a bit more later about this.
I think there might be another image. Tim, could you pass it, please? There we go. A little bit more detail of what you're doing, Tamas. Can you talk to this and explain us a little bit what we're seeing?
So actually a main motivation that brought us to do these investigations was not biodiversity alone, or to increase biodiversity alone. The main motivation was to prevent soil loss and the deterioration of soil properties overall, because some farmers were more aware of this and thus become more interested in sustainable interrow management methods. Because in the past decades, the most common management method was mechanical soil cultivation, intensive mechanical soil cultivation. But they started to leave the spontaneous flora, sowing annual mixtures or grass mixtures, and some of them even ordered multi-species form mixtures, mainly from abroad. But they were not always suitable for Hungarian conditions, and UMKI, the Hungarian Research Institute for Organic Agriculture, wanted to have a recipe, a mixture that is suitable for most Hungarian conditions. And the investigations began in 2012, together with farmers, consultants, seed companies, and university researchers.
That sounds really, really interesting. I'm not sure. Do we have a final image, or can I freelance? No, there we go.
Last
Final image.
And then after that, there is a slide that Tamas will speak to after this.
Fantastic. Tamas, go.
Yes, by designing such mixtures, we have to take into consideration various plant characteristics. And well, if you take out biodiversity, then I say we need low-growing, easy-to-maintain plant species that can provide sufficient soil cover. They are competitive enough to suppress or at least slow down unwanted species, but not too competitive for the cultivated plant. But when we also want to promote biodiversity, we have to take into consideration the needs of different arthropod groups. And it begins with flowering forms that only provide nectar and pollen for many arthropods, but that not only provide nectar and pollen for many arthropods, but also shelter. And therefore, when we have a hive cover of different flowering species, we can potentially attract many arthropod species. For example, you can see on the right picture or basic 6 species interrow mixture, and it not only provides a lot of flowers. As you can see, it's patchy. It's a 25 centimeter thick layer on the soil that not only shields the soil, but it can shelter a lot of arthropod species.
That is a fantastic thing. That this is going into a little bit more depth on the B side of the equation. Could you talk to this one, please, Tamas?
Yes, but before I will talk about the bees, it's interesting to emphasize that when we sow this 6 species mixture or basic mixture or plant species richness, it's not always increased. So we don't always increase the biodiversity of plants, but we increase the suitable habitats for arthropods. These 6 species is quite effective in suppressing weeds. but provides different resources for arthropods than the natural flora. The natural flora is often consists of wind-pollinated and vegetatively spreading species, and these are not good hosts for many species. They can host some species, but not a lot of arthropod species. And even though we have only 6 species and we not always increase the diversity of plants, we have very positive effects on arthropod assemblages. And now we can switch to the figure we have, because we measured the abundance of many arthropod groups from 2021 to 2024 with different sampling methods. And our results show positive trends in case of many beneficial arthropod groups like hoverflies, spiders, parasitic swabs, or white bees. You can see this figure with the data we have on white bees and honeybees. And here we compared the control, a low diversity seed mixture with that greenish blue, and the high diversity seed mixture with yellow. And as you can see, we increased the abundance of bees in case of both seed mixtures, and we also increased the number of species in case of both seed mixtures, but the difference between the high diversity and low diversity mixture is not significant. We have even higher nominal species richness of bees in case of our 6 species mixture.
That sounds absolutely brilliant. And I think it takes us quite nicely into a wee question that we have for you. And then I saw that Julie somewhere there. I can see her popping every now and then. She's also in the farm. But before we go, I wanted to first say it's really exciting, especially for people that have grown up in vineyards like I have. It's really exciting to see that things can change, that you don't have to have that conventional, perfect looking kind of thing, that this is actually an opportunity for farmers to actually start bringing biodiversity into their farms. And so I wanted to ask you, if you were to choose plant characteristics, which are the most important ones that you would consider absolutely key if you're designing a biodiversity-friendly perennial inter-row mixture? You can see that I had to write that down. I think that it's interesting for people to understand top tips. What would you focus on when thinking of biodiversity for this perennial inter-row mixtures? Tamas. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yes, excuse me.
No worries. So if you were thinking about what characteristics, top tip characteristics, should this perennial inter-row mixtures have for biodiversity, what would you suggest as the key characteristics that they should have?
Absolutely, that the species has to be low growing and easy to maintain and have a long flowering period. When you want to increase the cover of flowering species, it's easy, but when you want them to really flower, to really produce flower, you also have to take into consideration that many high nature value or high conservational value species, plant species, needs a lot of time to develop their flowering shoots and then to flower and produce seeds. It can even take months. And in a plantation, this time frame is not always there, simply. So usually it's a very important thing to consider the disturbance tolerance of a given species, and that you need to somehow to choose those species that are also present in disturbed habitats but can provide benefits arthropods.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This is always so inspiring to see people doing it sort of like frontline. So thank you, Tamas. And following on that sort of like people doing it, making it happen, you've already seen Julie in the video talking about her beautiful orchestra analogy, which might be one of my favorite pieces of poetry in this project so far. So Julie, welcome. We would love it if you can introduce your innovation hub and let us know a little bit about what you're doing in Switzerland at the moment. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Greetings from the mountain. I'm in the car right now. We are doing some yield assessment of our drought-resistant forage mixture. So sorry for that. It's maybe not the best setup. But I'm working at AGFF. This is the Swiss Grassland Society. It's a nationwide Swiss network of farmer agricultural institutions committed to advancing sustainable grassland-based forage systems. Our mission is to support environmentally friendly and economic production of homegrown, high-quality forage tailored to the diverse conditions of Swiss agricultural region. We have also one key achievement that we try to promote in Agroecology-TRANSECT. That's our seed standard mixture system with the AGFF quality label. And with this label, we guarantee to the farmer that the mixture that we brought to the market are scientifically developed and highly perform on-farm tests, that the seed mixture contains exclusively recommended cultivar, and that the seed quality is also outstanding regarding high germination rate and low contamination with weed seeds.
That sounds brilliant. So, sorry?
No, it's only one part of our work. We are also working with advisor, working on biodiversity mixture, working on on-farm trial. Now we are testing drought-resistant mountains mixture, so to bring more resilience into this system.
One of the things that I absolutely adore about your project is that you're doing all this and also bringing it to the customer in the shape of a label that actually highlights not only biodiversity, but actually functional biodiversity. So how would you describe functional biodiversity for the ones of us that are a little bit sort of like not completely au fait with the term? And why would you say it's important to talk to customers about it?
Yeah, we use especially functional biodiversity, and also specifically in mixture with the focus or the aim of forage production. And we try to work that the species composition contain for some mixture 4 to 12 species, and for the mixture with the aim to promote biodiversity up to 47. And with functional biodiversity, you refer to a variety of biological traits of a plant species that help each other to better fulfill ecological function of a system. It's not just about the number of species present, but the role these species play in the plant community. You can see on the screen, we have a nice red clover mixed with grasses. That's a typical mixture for forage production, intensive, I would say. And we select the species according to their functional traits, such as growth, rhythm. So we have early developing species and late developing species. We design it also with the specific root architecture in terms of depth and structure, the resistance to drought, to frost, and to trampling. And we try to work with the function and interaction, and that we create in that way a balanced productive system.
That's absolutely brilliant. That's so exciting to see. Julie, I hope that you're okay with staying in your car for a wee second more. You can see where Julie is. Come on, come on. But Tim, I know that we're tight on time, so I was going to suggest we move a little bit into the policy side of things, and then we can ask a few more questions. And also I see that in the chat, there's a few questions. If people want to continue answering them there, that would be amazing. There's also the follow-up email where we'll be answering some of them.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Julie, for joining us from the field. I love that you kind of add legitimacy to the project from joining us from the Swiss mountains. And if you want, I know there's a webinar from Julie and her colleague Andy online at the Agroecology-TRANSECT website. So you will share a link to that if you want to find out more about some of the stuff that those guys are doing there. You can do, and also Julie's the star of our film with the orchestra of the functional biodiversity playing in harmony together. So thanks, Julie, for joining us. And we'll move on, having heard from 3 innovation hubs now, to another of our researchers, and that's Lizzie Finch, who will introduce herself, I'm sure. And Lizzie has done lots of research into CAP and the effects of CAP on biodiversity, but not just biodiversity, but I think all 3 elements of the pillars that I mentioned at the beginning. But today we're talking about biodiversity. So I think you'll be focusing on that, Lizzie, won't you? But also if people have questions that go beyond that, chuck them in the chat anyway, or we can have a discussion later. So Lizzie, the floor is yours. Would you like me to stop sharing so you can share your slides?
That would be perfect. Thanks, Tim.
There we go.
Are you still sharing? Because it says it can't have multiple presenters sharing for this webinar. There we go. Perfect. Which one is it?
Sorry.
One. No worries.
As spotted. Hopefully.
Can everyone see this slide?
Looks good.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I'm Lizzie Finch. I'm from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and also the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research in Germany. And I'm going to give you a talk about how the CAP helps or hinders biodiversity, and as an additional extra, also ecosystem service provision. So for those who don't know, the CAP is the EU's agricultural policy. It was established as a response to low food supply after World War II, and historically it prioritized agricultural production, farmer incomes, and market stability. But in response to societal debates and pressure, it now also incorporates social and environmental objectives such as rural communities, climate change, and biodiversity. So it's I'm going to give a bit of an introduction about how the CAP works. So the CAP, the total cost of the CAP is about 55 billion euros per year, which I think is about like 40% of the EU budget. And it has a 2-pillar structure. So in this pillar 1 on the left, the first kind of instrument we see are direct payments. And these are subsidies given to farmers based on a per hectare basis. Related to direct payments, we have cross-compliance, and these are a list of rules and regulations that must be adhered to in order for farmers to get their direct benefits. Additionally, we have these greening payments, and 30% of the direct payments are tied up with this greening payment. And they have 3 different types of greening payments. So you have crop diversification, which basically just means that a farmer has to grow a certain number of crops on their field, on their farm in order to adhere to this greening payment. We also have protection of pastures. So basically we have to have protect grasslands on your farm, and then these ecological focus areas, which are kind of habitats which are good for biodiversity. So you need to have those on your farm as well. We also have voluntary coupled support, and this is an instrument which allows European countries to support specific agri-sectors based on the production or number of animals. So I think in France, if you are a dairy farmer, then you can get an extra payment for the amount of cows you have on your farm. And then moving on to Pillar 2, we have the agroecological climate measures, a bit of a mouthful there. And these are designed by the member states and the regions to achieve specific objectives. And these instruments are optional for farmers. They can opt in or opt out depending on how they feel. And then finally, we have the areas of nature constraint, and this is subsidies for farmers in difficult areas. So if you are high up in mountains, you can get money for farming those difficult areas. So what we did, there's basically been a lot of work on the effects of the CAP, and what we wanted to do is look at the effects on biodiversity, but also ecosystem services. And by ecosystem services, we're talking about here about benefits we get from nature. So for example, clean air, clean water, clean air, pollination, carbon sequestration. So we wanted to look at the effect of the CAP on those two biodiversity ecosystem services, but there's been a lot of work done before us. And so rather than doing the same thing again, what we want to do is synthesize all the information that's previously been published. So we looked for published scientific literature, which looked at this CAP period, so between 2007 and 2022. And what we did is when we found these scientific literature, we extracted all the information we needed. So what they were looking at, whether it's species diversity, species composition, pollination, and then we looked at what effect they found the CAP had on those factors. And we pulled all those out and then kind of summarized them. And here you can see on the right is a map of Europe, and you can see all the observations that we extracted. So mainly focused around Italy and Germany, but still a good spread throughout the rest of Europe. And here are the results. So for Pillar 1, for these direct payments, that's the payments that farmers get per hectare, we can see that for ecosystem services and biodiversity, there's overall a negative effect. So quite a big negative effect for ecosystem services and still a negative effect for biodiversity as well, with a few mixed and no effects. When we look at cross-conditionality, which is the set of rules you have to adhere in order to get your direct payments, we can see that they have a much more positive effect. So a large positive effect on ecosystem services. And even though we don't have that much data on the effect of cross-conditionality on biodiversity, we still see that they're having a positive effect generally. When we look at the greening payments, those three measures which are linked to direct payments, we can see it's a much more mixed bag. So there are positive effects on ecosystem services and biodiversity, but we see a lot of no effects. And in the case of ecosystem services, we also see some negative effects. And then finally, for voluntary coupled support, so that's the payment you get, which is coupled to the amount of animals you have on your farm. We can see another mixed bag effect. So mainly mixed effects with a few no effects and just, I think, one positive effect. So that's Pillar 1. And then looking to Pillar 2, for agri-environmental climate measures, we can see that for ecosystem services, there wasn't, I mean, there's still a lot of data. We found like 8 or 9 papers on this. We can see that they're mainly having a positive effect, although there's one negative effect. But for biodiversity, if you look at on the legend at the bottom, we can see over 40 observations that we found for agri-environmental climate measures having a positive effect on biodiversity, with just a few negative and no effects. And then for areas of nature constraint, we found no papers, so no evidence for that. So that was kind of summarizing all the results that we've been like in the scientific literature. And then we wanted to look at where the money was going to within the CAP. So if we imagine that this whole bar is the whole 55 billion euros per year CAP budget, I've broken it down. So direct payments makes up about 40% of the whole CAP budget, which is having a negative effect. So this bar on the left. When we add in the voluntary coupled support and also the greening payment, which we showed had a mixed effect on biodiversity ecosystem services, that makes up about 71% of the CAP budget. The areas of nature constraint, that grey bar there, which we said there wasn't enough evidence for, that's about 3% or 3.7%, I think. And then for agri-environmental climate measures, which is the green bar, which is the only instrument we found which was having a generally positive effect on biodiversity ecosystem services, that makes up about 6.3% of the CAP budget. And then this other instrument, so I've taken you through a very simplified version, like a description of the CAP, but there are a lot of other instruments which we just basically have no idea about, like their effect on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So as the outlook, a large share of the CAP budget still supports instruments that harm biodiversity or have uncertain or mixed effects, where conditions are attached to payments. So for example, cross-conditionality and direct payments, they can deliver positive outcomes. But when we look at like what the CAP is now, these conditionalities are being steadily weakened under the current CAP. So last year, a lot of the rules that were in cross-conditionality have been cancelled. So they're getting slowly, progressively weakened. And then also these agri-environmental climate measures have a real potential to benefit diversity. But when we look at the literature in more detail, it really depends on good design and strong ambition from the member states, but also from Europe itself. And that's it. These are my collaborators, just to thank them because they also did a lot of work on it. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, for that whistle-stop tour. And I think your paper is not, is it published yet? It's not quite published?
No, it hasn't been finished yet.
But when it is, I'm sure there's many people on this call who would be interested to see it. So all of our papers are published in the resources section of Agroecology-TRANSECT website, or a link at least is published. So you can go and look more at what Lizzie's done. And I don't think you've done a webinar on it yet, but we might get you in, Lizzie, I think, before the end of the project to do a more detailed look at everything that you've done. I've got a couple of questions before we move on to Adrian, if that's okay. Sort of thinking about the bigger picture and the challenge of supporting biodiversity conservation. It's not a brilliant picture of the current state, I guess, especially with what you were saying about the or if anything, it's getting slightly worse as that what you call it, cross conditionality sort of is removing some of those things that are helping biodiversity. But what other are there any kind of clear barriers that came out from your study to biodiversity conservation from a CAP point of view? Are there anything? Yeah, what stood out, if anything?
Yeah, so I think the main one is just like the way that the policy is designed. So we have within the CAP, we have like cross-conditionality and agroecological climate measures and also greening. We're all supposed to be kind of green instruments that were supposed to improve the sustainability of the CAP. But even within those instruments, we find that the policy, there's like massive barriers within the policy design. So for example, there are lots of effective measures which are included, which farmers can get subsidies for. So within greening, these ecological focus areas, there are a lot of options there which you could get subsidies for, which basically had no proven benefit for biodiversity or ecosystem services. And also, it's not just like having ineffective options, but there's also like a lack of ambition in some of the measures. So in the crop diversification measure, which I talked about as part of greening, I mean, crop diversification is good for biodiversity, right? But the level at which they set crop diversification, it meant only 5% of farmers actually had to change their management practices. So only had like 5% of the whole farmers in the EU. So they were just very unambitious with the targets. And also, I mean, there's also lots of exemptions for farmers not having to adhere to these rules. And I think also another big thing is just the funding, right? So like in the graph I showed, it's like 6.3% of the whole CAP budget goes towards a measure which we can positively show has an effect on biodiversity and ecosystem services.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess the obvious next question for me is with CAP being reformed and the next kind of iteration of CAP, are you in a position to sort of say what you think? I mean, if we could think of 2 or 3 quick wins to boost biodiversity that CAP kind of could bring in, could you say what those are, or is that a bit beyond where you're at?
No, I definitely can. I'm not sure if they're like quick wins, but there may be the idealized version of like we should definitely be increasing the budgets for these agroecological climate measures and making sure that when we ask farmers to do sustainable management practices, that we're covering the implementation costs. In a lot of the papers that I saw, basically farmers are doing stuff which they're not getting the money back from. Also strengthening the cross-conditionality rules so that we stop reducing them. would be a great option. And also when we're designing these kind of more environmental instruments, just making sure they're grounded in scientific evidence to make sure that they are actually having the effect that we want them to have. Those would be my kind of 3 top things.
Great, thanks. That's nice bite-sized sound bites there. We can put them on a policy brief maybe and ship them off to Brussels.
Sounds good.
On a more serious note, I guess, hopefully that's something we're doing as a project, is provide, like you said, your last point there about, hopefully we're able to provide some of the data, some of the science. We're quantifying, like I said at the beginning, these positive effects that these more agroecological practices or sustainable practices have on biodiversity, and as well as, and again, I know you looked at climate change, the effect on climate change, and also sort of socio-economic resilience. So hopefully we're providing an evidence base for that as a project. I had some other questions I wanted to ask you, but I'm gonna, if it's all right, Lizzie, I'm sorry to move on, but I really want to hear from Adrien before we finish, and if there's time, hopefully I can ask 1 or 2 of those questions at the end. So thank you, Lizzie. Adrien Svortebrooks, hopefully I've said that vaguely right, is at CRAW in Wallonie, the Centre for Agricultural Research, I think, or similar. And he also is the Innovation Hub facilitator now for our Innovation Hub in Belgium. And he is going to come along kind of keeping slightly on the kind of policy, but also diverging from it. He's going to introduce our multi-criteria analysis tool, which is looking at a way of how do we've talked a lot about the benefits of biodiversity, but how do we come up with a good standard list of indicators for biodiversity, so we can aim to improve it and almost in a way that could then be included in some of that future regulation or policy environments as well. So he'll talk about it much better than I will. So I'll hand over to you, Adrien. If you're able to share your screen, yes, without me stopping. I'll let you introduce yourself and present. The floor is yours, and we'll have some questions at the end. Thanks, Adrien.
Thank you, Tim. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Perfectly. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Everything is fine. So hello, everybody. I'm Adrien Svortebrooks, and I'm working, as Tim mentioned, in a Belgium research center focused on agriculture, a public research center. And I wanted first to also talk about 2 other persons, which are Cecilia Zagaria from Wageningen University and Marianne Delove from my research center also in Belgium, because I'm working, as the team say, as a work package leader where we develop this tool and also as innovation facilitators, but that's more aside. But I wanted to say that they are the 2 persons that also developed this tool more on field. So they are important, I guess, to mention, and also if you have a further question. But so to go into the multi-criteria assessment tool and this spotlight on biodiversity, well, as you already have heard about, there are 11 innovation hubs that are engaged in the agroecological transition. And what we did with our colleague was to basically develop a framework, a tool, to try to assess the multi-performances of agroecology. Because of course there is not one performance associated to it, but multiple, and biodiversity is one of it. And so basically we developed a farm survey and some measurement to it. And so the idea was really to generate actionable knowledge for those 11 innovation hub, but also to provide evidence of this multi-performance assessment. So we try to assess first which agroecological principles and practices are farms engaging with in those 11 innovation hubs, and also what are those impacts on farm impact of those engagement. So we co-developed, if we look at this farm impact, we co-developed it with the innovation facilitators with 2 leading questions. First, to determine what should agroecology deliver on, and so talk more about the evaluation criteria, but also the important question, how to measure those multi-performances and to talk about those indicators. It was occurring in co-innovation workshops, so my colleague Cecilia took time to discuss and to develop this tool with the scientists and the practitioner of the project, and we really wanted to make it locally actionable insights for the practitioners, so make it relevant for the scientific world and the practitioners. But we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so of course we took inspiration of existing framework for the evaluation, such as the 13 principles that we already mentioned in previous presentation, but also from existing tools that develop also indicators such as tape. And so if we looked at first at this idea of evaluate the agroecology, well, the 13 principles were something we broadly use in the project, but not only, as we now even go further, but at least was a start for this tool. And there is, as you can see, one that is directly linked to biodiversity, but also others that are linked to it. For instance, the animal earth, the economic diversification, the synergy, of course, that we can find through biodiversity. And so that was a start for discussion that occurred during this co-innovation work with the practitioners of the project and the scientists. And some things came upon regarding biodiversity. Here are some instances of some words. So it was handwritten, but I think it was really to show that we discussed it directly with them. So the semi-natural grassland, for instance, local breeds, like discussing about recovering the agrobiodiversity, the pesticide use, maybe focus on birds, so really different discussion, talking about measurement of some species, about looking at habitats, looking about a lot of different things. And so we inspired after this discussion from existing tools, such as you can see here on the screen. The famous one, I would say, taped from FAO, Oasis from Agroecology Europe recently developed, etc., etc. So we took inspiration, and what we saw is that for a part of it, there is things related to the plant biodiversity, and I think we already talked about it in this in those previous presentation. The presence of semi-natural habitats, also for a part of it, and the functional biodiversity of those in those tools, so looking at fertility, pest control, etc. And maybe the one that was here less, or my colleague mentioned that was less tackled, was this idea of natural habitats. So it's maybe a bit something specific that we developed. So we came to 9 topics broad topics in general, and 2 of them are directly related to biodiversity. First, the plant agrobiodiversity, and then the associated agrobiodiversity. If we look at the plant agrobiodiversity, the indicators that at the end we came upon after all those discussions and exchanges was first the land use diversity, the crop rotational diversity, the number of cultivated crops, and the diversity of domestic animals. Then if we look at the associated biodiversity, the indicators are number of semi-natural habitat types, the length of the edges per hectare, intensity of pesticides and fertilizer, intensity of grazing and mowing, diversity of earthworm groups, and total biomass. So we did earthworm measurements. And so what is maybe is here interesting to mention is that we also looked, and maybe that's not the case of all tools, to the management intensities or proxies. So the pressures of the use, for instance, on regarding the intensity of pesticide use, fertilizer use, grazing, mowing, etc. So that's really what we came with at the end of the development process. And here we wanted to show some preliminary results because it's not yet fully ended for all the Innovation Hub, and the process is still ongoing, but still we find it was interesting to show what type of result can we come upon with those with this tool. And so here we take a result from the Bulgarian Innovation Hub, which was supposed to be the one that we discussed just before, but due to technical issue, it was at the end the first one that were presented. But fine, just so I think you guess the context of it: grassland management, high nature value, grassland, etc. So for this one, we wanted to show a bit some typical results. Here, if you look at the associated agrobiodiversity, so the number of semi-natural habitats, and it's first mentioned that all the 10 lines are the different farms that were assess with this tool. And so for each farm, you can see how much the bar is bigger, how much the number of semi-natural habitats is higher. And so you can see here that it's for all of those, it's between 3 and 5. So quite homogeneous between those farms for this one. And so, yeah, I didn't mention, but those semi-natural habitats can be hedges, trees, bushes, forests, ditches, streams, terrace, heaps, etc. If we look at one other indicators, maybe the story is a bit different. If we look at diversity of domestic animals, well, the index here represents how diverse the type of animals are present on each farm. As you can see here, different results, some that are more higher. Here, for instance, there are cows, sheep, horses, but some that maybe are a bit lower because they only have a cattle. So that doesn't tell the whole story, but just mentioning for the diversity of animals that there is a heterogeneity in this case. And if we look at another one, which is even more diverse, if we look at the farms, well, and looking at the land use, so how we use the land. If we look at one farm, we can see that the land use is, the index is super high because there is grassland, not for the arable crops and for the arable crops, but for others which are purely focused on grassland. And then we can't show any diversity regarding this. Again, it doesn't tell all the story, but just showing that for these specific indicators, there is huge difference in this innovation. So that's the type of result that we can come upon with the tool. And just wanted to show also the next step that are coming and what we are discussing. A slide that is maybe more appealing for the people that love the statistic. For the others, really sorry. So here we wanted to look at, so we take really the land use, how we use the land, which was the previous assessment we did, and we wanted to compare to other indicators. So seeing if there is a link with land use and other indicators or not. And so here we took with my colleague, thank you to my colleague who bring those results. We see that for 4 of them, the 4 that are here, there is a correlation, so meaning there is a link from the results we get. For instance, if we look at the number of semi-natural habitat, there is a link between land use and semi-natural habitats present in the farms. Same for climate-resilient agronomic practices. The same for the revenue in comparison to other funds, so things that are not directly linked to biodiversity, but still we see in all results an interesting correlation. And even for the active engagement in agroecological knowledge network, we see a perfect correlation, meaning that the farms that have a high land use, diverse land use, also have a higher engagement in agroecological knowledge networks. And for people that love statistics, you can even see that the R is 1 and the P is 0. So it's kind of perfect association between those 2 indicators. Just correlation does give a lot of explanation after that, but then we have to research about that. But that's interesting preliminary results. And that's something to be continued. So thank you for your attention. If you have interest, you can contact Cecilia or Marie-Hélène, which are both of my colleagues that develop this. And of course, if you have a question, feel free.
Thank you, Adrien, for sticking so brilliantly to time, as well as a very interesting presentation. Just to say, because I know Bill's asked in the chat and Marie-Hélène has answered, but like a lot of the things you've heard today, these aren't presentations on finished published papers. This is ongoing stuff, and exactly. I know that the methodology, a paper about the methodology is being written at the moment, and there is a desire to an aspiration to publish a paper with the results perhaps next year, according to Marie-Hélène in the chat. So watch this space. We'll 100% will do a webinar on it. If this really interests you, keep an eye on our website and we will do a webinar on it, but it'd be good to do that perhaps when we've got some more initial results back to make it richer. And a reminder too that because Adrien and the team and Cecilia and Marie-Hélène have looked at not just biodiversity but also climate change and socioeconomic resilience with this tool, with this analysis tool. but we're here today to talk about biodiversity, but it's much richer than we're necessarily talking about today. I've got literally 2 questions, if that's okay for me, and then there's not that long left for the overall session. So then we've got lots and lots of questions for the wider panel that maybe tie some of these ideas together. The first one, you mentioned tape earlier on, and I as a comms person, I like to think of what our USP is, what's our unique selling point within the project. So with that in mind, how is this sort of MCA tool, multi-criteria analysis tool, different to some of those things like tape or Oasis, which some people might know? They're already there. How is this different, and why is that important, Adrien?
Well, first, as I mentioned, we inspired from this tool. So the idea was not to reinvent the wheel and start something again, which is maybe something really important here in this tool. Also in other, but particularly in us, was the co-development process. So mentioning that we wanted to really co-develop something with the practitioners and the scientists inside of this project. The fact that it's also for the EU context, because it was the scope of Agroecology-TRANSECT project. So others are also for the EU as a oasis from Agroecology Europe, obviously, but other are not related. So that's maybe something particular. Also, the innovation hub are quite diverse in terms of shape and scope. So some tools are really dedicated to farms. Here we wanted to have a tool that embraces the diversity of innovation hub. So that's maybe also something specific. And then also the fact that there is this the context of science practitioner projects. So we could also go a bit further in terms of measurements of the soil, of the earthworm, because we knew that in the innovation hub there was possibility, or we could develop this possibility of having those measurements. And then maybe, yeah, something which is specific to this project is the 3 pillars, as you mentioned. So it's not only about biodiversity, but also about resilience of the socioeconomic resilience of the farms, climate mitigation and adaptation. So those are really a broad tool, I would say, and for more biodiversity, which is the one that we are tackling today. Which is maybe specific is really the fact that we wanted to tackle the management intensity proxies related to biodiversity, which seems to be important. Fertilizers, pesticide use, etc.
Great, thank you. And another thing, I know that the tool is designed to be used by this project and by researchers, but I kind of wonder if beyond our project of TRANSECT, if you have any idea of where it could be taken. Could it be developed in a way that practitioners and farmers could use it, perhaps in a sort of app format or in any other way? Or how do you see it developing beyond Agroecology-TRANSECT?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's really a tool developed here for this context, and so it's really shaped in terms of timing, in terms of energy that we want to develop, etc., to the project. And as I mentioned, it's not always the case that you have scientists that can make a specific measurement, send it to a laboratory to have you need the money also to do that. So yeah, in that way, maybe I would say it's specific to it. Yet it's really related, inspired to other tools. So we could imagine, and even we hope, that it could inspire other tool. And because the development of such tools is really an ongoing process that never ends, because we have to be adapted to the context better, we hope that what we developed and what Cecilia and Marianne have developed can inspire other tool process. So maybe T-tool in this next version could include some of the indicators. Why not? Let's hope it.
Great, a lot of potential there then. And finally, and perhaps briefly, because I know we're running a bit over time, it's super early days in terms of results that you and the team have kind of produced. But talking about biodiversity, are there anything standing out to you from these sort of early results that showcase, how agroecology can benefit biodiversity in the way that we need it, we want it to?
Well, I would say I would give the typical scientific answer, saying that we need to go along all the analysis and all the results to give really a robust evidence, and that's why what we want to make and to produce, in this project, which are robust evidence. And of course, agroecology is a broad word, so it's translated first in the 11 Innovation Hub very differently, but also in Europe or even the world very differently. So it's hard to give really a yes or no answer to this broad question. But yet what we can see is that there is sometimes really synergies. That's also with the correlation we see, etc., that there is maybe some link that are important between biodiversity, so agrobiodiversity, associated biodiversity, but also climate change, etc. Resilience of the farm. So I think there is synergy, but sometimes also trade-offs. So meaning that sometimes also you have to make a choice between different elements and where you want to push the buttons. So that's something that come already. But yeah, we need to see fully the end, and maybe Cian already start to set us some answers, but yet for the aim of this project we need to go a bit further to give you a precise answer.
Thank you. A very scientific, very scientist's answer to a question. Me as the journalist wants to know what's the trend.
Yeah.
But you had a slide saying to be continued. So I guess for many of us, it's a case of watch this space. But very exciting and interesting. And again, thank you for presenting and explaining what is a very complex thing that you do with that work into a way that even I can understand. Yeah. You must be doing something right if I understand it. Thanks, Adrien.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I see Anna has turned her camera on and is back with us. So it's here in the UK, it's 10:45. For many of you, it's probably 11:45. We're thinking about lunch or perhaps another coffee. So I would like the last 15 minutes would be really nice to answer some of the questions from the chat. Please keep asking them. It's a webinar format, so your cameras won't be on. So it's just questions in the chat, ideally, please. And we've got some that we want to answer that we've kind of been noticing. And Janka has joined us again, which is good because I've got a question for you in just a second. So keep the camera on. Yes, everyone, all of our panelists are coming back, which is nice, but don't feel you have to. I'm waffling. Anna, do you have a question or do you have any reflections for the last 15 minutes?
It's a lot, isn't it? No, I was just going to, from a practical point of view, I just wanted to highlight to everyone who's been asking in the chat about potential publications, about all these topics. They are coming. They will be available as resources in our website. So in the follow-up email, you will have the links to the Agroecology-TRANSECT website where you're going to be able to find them as they come and when they come. And also, if you're following us in social media, not to plug us shamelessly, but that's a really good way to know when they're coming because we're trying to make them available as much as possible, a little bit like Bill was saying. He found out about this project a little bit late in the day, but there's still time to engage. There's still time to learn about all this amazing things and engage with all these practitioners and academics who, if you ask me, have been doing a cracking job, if I say that myself. So I was just wanted to highlight that before we went into the questions, and I'm not sure if you want to start with any particular question, Tim. Otherwise, I can always kick it.
Well, I have a question which I like from Lucas. I can't remember, Lucas, where you're based. Apologies, but a question for Janka. There were a couple of questions, but one that interested me was Lucas says, we often find that when we introduce metrics and targets that practitioners and farmers can start to focus quite narrowly just on the targets rather than creating a holistic system that is so key to agroecology, I suppose. How do you think we can meet this challenge? The challenge being focusing just on targets, which I guess in a way results-based payments could encourage. And there's a second part that came later. It seems to me that understanding of resilience needs to be embedded in a cultural understanding of the benefits, similar to a peasant moral economy, because the benefits might not show up in cold numbers on the balance sheet. So I guess the question is, how do we avoid focusing purely on targets, even with results-based systems? And also the things like, I guess, cold numbers on a balance sheet. We can do our best to think of as many indicators as we can, but nature is so complex, isn't it, that it's hard to think of everything. So how do we take that into account? Janke, would you like to take that at first, and then we might come to someone else?
Yes, definitely. Well, for us, the starting point was that we didn't have any numbers actually. So we didn't know what was going on. So what was there, what has left, what has changed. So we need to have some numbers. I mean, we have to know how this management is impacting the biodiversity on the ground. Otherwise, it's just talking, and just talking is not good enough. But I agree that the moment we narrow down the results, let's say, that we are aiming at, and our result-based scheme to a very narrow set of quantitative, so 5 numbers of species or 10 number or 30 number, it is going to be a problem. Actually, we are having a problem of narrowing down the 80-something plant species that are of conservation value in these grasslands to a more manageable number so that farmers, advisors, controllers on the field can recognize them. Because if you're not a botanist, it's very difficult to grasp the diversity. And the people that were at the meeting in Western Stara Planina, you remember the sheets with the photos that we did, and we are distributing to farmers, but also to experts, and they're only 40, I think, there, and they were not the full list that we have. So what we try to do is have a long list of valuable plant species that are there, and farmers can indicate any number. I mean, we're still negotiating on what this number would be, but any number of them. So it is not just these 10, for example, but from the list of 80 or whatever we come to, if you indicate 10 or whatever it is, this is what will be good enough. So, or at least this is our working approach at the moment. And it is very difficult to come down to even this number. What will be this number? So we are not limiting only to them, but even to limit any in this number is quite tricky and difficult. But there is a balance between making it extremely strict, but then having nothing at all. So there has to be a balance on this continuum, and this is where we are trying to get to.
Yeah, thanks,
Okay.
Janke. I think that's
Yeah.
clear. I wonder if anyone else on the panel, and Bertrand Dumont, who's our coordinator of the project and holds the overall project and partners, is also joined us and may want to answer. But has anyone else got any thoughts on that idea of us becoming too distracted by just looking at metrics when actually with agroecology and it should be much more wider than that? I mean, I don't know if that's something you've considered with the work with the MCA tool. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in, and if not, we'll move on to the next question.
No, yeah, I guess that's also the main idea of having a multi-performance tool is really trying to avoid this unique focus on something specific. And so I present part of the indicators, but the list of indicators is quite long, and so that's really the aim to try to assess. I would say everything, but it's impossible to assess everything. But to assess, I would say, in different direction, and to be sure that there is no blind spot, and that to be able to focus on one indicator, yeah, can be dangerous. And that's an effect that we, when you mentioned the KPA, etc., of the performance indicators in society, is that the risk is to be too focused. So that's where I think it's a good thing to be broad open to multi-performances. That's the first steps, and then yeah, maybe trying to be aware of it, and if there is some discussion about it, yeah, trying to be not too focused only on the indicators. The human behind the indicators are also important, so the farmers, etc. And so that's also part of the project, to discuss with them and make it relevant also for them.
Thanks, Adrien. Yeah, that's really interesting perspective.
And this is also why we are developing this multi-criteria assessment tool, because beyond the very initial result that Adrien has presented at the end, and of course a correlation does not always reveal an effect, we really want to assess the multi-performance of these agroecological farms in different dimensions. And when you ask Tim about what is unique in our project, is really that we try to combine the three main dimensions, which are adaptation to climate change and mitigation of the effect of climate change, biodiversity in farm habitats, and farm socioeconomic resilience. And that's why really we want to see whether there are some outstanding farms that have better performance than the regional average in all these dimensions. And one thing I would like also to highlight, to add something to Cian's presentation, is that in Cian's meta-analysis, so there were 123 papers that were analyzed on biodiversity, but we also investigate the effect of these agroecological interventions on climate change mitigation. And overall positive effects of agroecological interventions on biodiversity where also some of these interventions also had positive effects on some variables of climate change mitigation, especially soil carbon storage and reduction of N2O emissions. But with these papers, we did not reveal any positive interventions on the mitigation of CO2 or methane. And indeed, you can then try to understand why there are such results. And finally, we concluded that results for CO2 emissions are not that surprising, because in our meta-analysis, all of the retains today with data on CO2 fluxes focus on soil respiration, indeed, and thus on biogenic CO2. And indeed, increased biogenic CO2 emissions agree with the results on increased decomposer population, suggesting active communities and potentially healthier agroecosystems. And also increased CO2 emissions can also be explained by increase in plant root biomass associated with increases in plant biodiversity and plant productivity. So you see from this example that benefiting biodiversity will also increase soil respiration, soil roots, and that at the end, you do not have any benefits on CO2 emissions, but you have benefits on carbon stocks in the soil. So all the things are interconnected, and this is really why we develop such multi-criteria assessment tool, and while we assess the performance of the system and the benefits of agroecological interventions in different dimensions simultaneously.
Thanks, Bertrand. Anna, do you have a question burning from the list of questions we've got? We've probably got time for one last one.
What do you think? One last one.
I would think, yes, and a wrap up, because it's been a long morning. I was also going to
suggest, it has been, but before we go to questions, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone asking the questions, because they've been really, really interesting.
And a lot were answered in the chat as well, so we will try and capture that when we kind of report on this on our webpage. So you'll see a lot of those with links to the articles. There's a question from Neve from CAFOD, Neve Fury, which I'm not going to ask because it's going to open a huge can of worms, but I did want to mention. I'm not going to put it to panel, there isn't time, but there's a question around the risk of it's not necessarily relevant to biodiversity, but the risk of agroecology being subsumed in some way by the push for regenerative agriculture, in quotes. What are the risks of corporate capture and the social side of agroecology being disregarded? Neve, I think unfortunately that's another webinar and discussion for today, but I did like the question, and I would say there is this dialogue going on, which we will be talking about more when we have completed it with our partners on agroecology and definitions and agroecology and its narratives. But it's an interesting question. But I just wanted to mention it. But Anna, do you have a question? One last question.
Well, I think that we're really, really tight in time. So the last question that I wanted to present to everyone, just because I thought it was interesting in terms of the practice, and of course, I'm always going to go to the practice. There's an interesting question from Matteo, and I think this is very much for Lizzie, but also for practitioners. around thinking, how does policy work and how payments work? In terms of, do you think that how does this tension between annual payments that really motivate people on the short run to do things, sort of like play against having long-term policies and long-term payments? Is there one that's more effective than the other? Does it need to be a balance? What have you seen and what are the trends? So Lissy, I'm not sure if you're the one that wants to answer that challenging approach, but I see that Janka probably has an opinion because I see her raise her eyebrows. So
I might pass this on to Janka because I feel like she has more experience with like how the payments work on the agricultural lands.
Go for it.
Well, if we talk to farmers, I think they would prefer the annual flexibility that they have, because 5 years is a lot, and especially in our region, 5 years is also related to the access to land, because a lot of the grasslands that they use is common land. So the allocation of this is for certain periods, 5, 10, but there is a balance. So they would prefer annual. But then from a biodiversity perspective and longer term impact, it's much better to be multi-annual. So the question again is, where is the balance between the different interests? And I would stop here because time is running, so to have time for some more.
I absolutely love that, to finish on that little piece around the trade-offs and the importance to actually keep both a short-term and a long-term and a medium-term perspective on all these things, which is something that has been popping up in all the discussions and the comments. Tim, I will give you the last word, but in the meantime, I hate always leaving these things without a little bit of like at least an assessment of how you guys are feeling. So I'm going to share our last Menti, and all one from you guys. It's such a simple one. Is to answer 2 questions. You can do it at your own time, either now or later. It's all set so that you can continue. But if you can go to Menti one more time and let us know first, on a scale from 1 to 10, how are you feeling about the status of biodiversity in Europe, about whether you're hopeful or not hopeful? It's really nice to see that people are hopeful so far. So feel free to answer that question. You can go at your own pace. And then the next question, which you can move into once you're ready, is just to ask you guys if this event changed the way that you're seeing things, brought you something, or helped you. All this information is really useful for us to make sure that the next time we actually customize it to what you guys need. As mentioned before, there will be a follow-up email. We're going to try to compile a lot of the questions and answers that have happened in the chat as well. So it's your opportunity as well, finally, to shout out in the chat if you have a link that you want to share about an organization or something else. Tim, that's going to be me leaving you to the end.
Anna, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who came to speak, all of our partners from across the project. It's a super busy time for everyone, both in the field and in the lab or in the office. So thank you for joining us and bringing your amazing range of expertise to this roadshow. If you enjoyed it, there is a webinar program. We do a webinar roughly every 2 months at least, talking about outputs from the project, and we've got 2 more of these roadshow format longer events where we do a showcase of our results. The next one will be in November, and it will be about policy and how important agroecology is to the policy environment, and how we can try and affect that, including some of our own policy recommendations or policy briefs as a project. So please join us for that. I don't have a date, but it will be around November time online, and follow agroecology-transect.net for all the latest of the work that we're doing. Thanks for your time too. And if no one else has got anything to add, I think I'll close this, and we'll see you next time. Enjoy going out and enjoy the biodiversity. Enjoy going out and counting the last of the butterflies, perhaps, to appreciate the biodiversity we've got around us. Thank you. Goodbye.